Hey guys, so I said I'd be doing more responses, so here's a response absolutely nobody asked for. There's this guy who I've been subscribed to for ages despite never having watched a single one of his videos. I really don't know how I got subscribed to him in the first place, but first things first, his name is Rationality Rules. Personally, I think it should be up to other people to determine whether my arguments are rational. That's why I'm named after a crazy person from a fantasy book. People know what they're getting. Anyway, response. So basically the whole argument is that the second referendum would destroy British democracy. I've already made a very substantial video about this, which I'll link in the comments section. If you're coming to this video from a critical perspective, then you should definitely watch that video as it provides a lot more important context. But I will repeat a lot of the points in this video. Anyway, while I was making that video, I saw an article arguing that a second referendum would destroy British democracy, and I was considering responding to it, but I put it off, and now I have a video to respond to. So let's see just how rational these arguments are.
In a recent Patreon poll, I asked whether or not I should make this video, and I'm very glad that you voted in favour, because if you didn't, I would have made you re-vote.
So right off the bat we have an analogy that fails, because many YouTubers will often keep bringing back topics into these polls that they want to do. Indeed, many YouTubers will have a poll between two topics and decide to do both anyway. This doesn't particularly matter, but it shows how this guy's idea that all votes are sacred and should be respected falls apart.
And if, for example, Ireland was pushing for a second abortion referendum, then that would be the theme rather than Brexit.
So here we have this guy comparing the abortion referendum to the EU referendum. So let's just run through some obvious differences. 1. The margin in the abortion referendum was huge. Ireland voted to legalise abortion by 2/3 to 1/3, meaning twice as many people voted to legalise abortion as voted to keep it illegal. Conversely, only a little over 50% of people voted to leave the EU. There is much more of a basis to suppose that one of these results might be different in a second referendum. Fun fact, this guy states the margin as a number rather than the percentage, so that it sounds bigger.
The United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union by a margin of 1.4 million people.
The margin for the Ireland result was very small in terms of an actual number, but it was huge in terms of the percentage point. This is just a lesson in stating the percentage rather than the actual number, so that you're giving an actual reflection of these numbers as a proportion of those who voted. 2. There is no new information that could come to light regarding abortion. In general, one can weigh up whether they think a fetus is a person or not, and then they can weigh this up against concerns over a woman's bodily autonomy. This will form their opinion on abortion. Pretty much all the information is already out there, and the essential question is almost axiomatic, concerning your personal opinions on the aforementioned considerations. Conversely, with the EU, there were economic, diplomatic, social and political implications. There are a whole load of things that could change, causing people to change their mind. We now have a better idea of our economic, diplomatic, social and political outlook if leaving the EU goes ahead than we did before the initial vote. We don't have any better of an idea whether or not a fetus is a person or whether that is more important than a woman's bodily autonomy. 3. There is one clear answer in abortion. Should it be legal or not? There are minor considerations like up until what point should abortion be permissible in the pregnancy, and whether the government should adopt a safe, legal and rare approach or actively encourage abortion. Now, by contrast, do I really need to rub this point in? There are a massive number of potential Brexit outcomes. The minute negotiations started, it became clear that a simple in-out referendum should never have occurred in the first place. The only truly democratic election would be one that included the different varieties of Brexit going up against Remain in a preferential vote. Anything else will just be asking people for a nebulous Brexit and then potentially providing a Brexit that nobody wanted, all for the sake of some bizarre commitment to some bizarre version of democracy where people get what they don't want because democracy.
What's more, I sincerely believe that a second referendum that includes an option to remain in the EU would mean the death of democracy in the UK.
And this is when we get this hilarious line. The death of democracy in the UK. No matter how many times I hear this, I laugh. And I'll get into why this ridiculous claim is so funny to me in a moment.
But others immediately petitioned for a second referendum.
We also had Nigel Farage talking about a second referendum before the results were even in. I will say that I do think the people calling for a second referendum right away have much less justification than the people calling for one now.
But as time has gone on, the prospect of a second referendum has become all the more likely.
Yeah, for all the aforementioned reasons. There was a small margin, more information has come to light, and the complexities of the question are causing serious disagreement. But also, that's how any good democracy should work. The longer it's been since a previous vote, the more valid the claim that there should be a second vote. That's why we have a maximum amount of time a government can go without calling a general election. So with every passing day, the legitimacy of the mandate from that nearly 3-year-old referendum becomes increasingly tenuous. That's just how democracy works.
But, And this is the point. If lying constituted a revote, then we would be literally revoting on everything forever.
The main difference is that these lies relate directly to my previous position that new information is coming to light. There are several key points, but most significant is the idea that it would be easy for the UK to get a deal with the EU. Many people who voted to leave probably assumed leaving would be relatively simple. Get a decent enough deal, leave, sorted. But instead, it's become increasingly clear that actually, this isn't simple at all, and there's plenty of reason to think things might not end well for the UK. Therefore, yes, second referendum.
If the Remain campaign had won, would it be right to demand a second referendum because they lied when they said that 2/3 of British manufacturing jobs depend on the EU? Or that the average British family would immediately be £4,300 worse off? Or that unemployment rates would skyrocket? Or that the government would immediately trigger Article 50? Or that the Treasury would need to significantly increase taxes and slash public spending? Or that the UK itself would break up? No.
It's interesting that I don't believe anybody has heard of the lies coming from the Remain side. This is because none of those lies were significant. The lies from the Leave side were significant. While he says that most of the reasons people said they wanted to leave the EU had nothing to do with the lies, even a very small factor could easily affect the very small margin by which Leave won.
Of 168 polls, fewer than 55 predicted a Leave outcome, and Ladbrokes offered odds of 4-1 in favour of Remain. But they were all catastrophically wrong.
They weren't catastrophically wrong, it was a very close result.
But most importantly, let's say that we somehow knew that the UK had really changed its mind. Would this justify a second referendum? No, it wouldn't. It would justify a vote to rejoin the EU after leaving, but it wouldn't justify revoking a previous democratic decision.
He makes this claim twice.
The vote happened and it must be respected, and the fact that it's not yet been delivered doesn't change this. The UK voted to leave the EU, and therefore the UK must leave the EU. Period. However, to reiterate the point that I just made in relation to the previous argument, upon a time after the UK has left the EU, I see no issues in having a new referendum in which we ask the public if they'd like to rejoin.
And it seems obviously ridiculous and most definitely not rational. This guy is saying that there'd be no problem having a referendum to leave the EU the minute we've left, but we can't have a second referendum until we've left. I would argue, correctly, that if anything the opposite is true. The only time it's worth having a second referendum is before we've left, since most of the basis for having a referendum is that leaving has proven to be such a headache. Once we've left would be the one time it would make the least sense to have a second referendum, since we've just gone through all the aggro of leaving, and also are very unlikely to get back in at that point. And again, it's been 3 years. We have a perfect opportunity right now to renew the democratic mandate, perhaps organise a more logical referendum using a preferential voting system where several different options are weighed up against each other, either avoid leaving entirely or get a clearer idea of precisely what kind of exit the British people want, and we're at a point right now where we are perhaps the most flexible. If your principles cause you to act so illogically, then you need new principles.
Furthermore, I simply have to defend the dead here. Those who make this argument are spitting on the graves of our ancestors. You know, the ones who voted for us to join the EU in the first place, but since changed their mind. To be blunt, have some bloody respect.
Fuck old people.
However, when issuing the Brexit referendum, the government explicitly promised to enact the result.
A different government promised to enact the result. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. There is one person on the planet who had any obligation to deliver Brexit, and that was David Cameron. David Cameron called a referendum, and then when the results came out, he resigned. That resignation, right there, was a reboot. When Theresa May came into power, there would have been absolutely nothing anti-democratic about her ignoring the results to a referendum she didn't call. One of the essential institutions of British democracy is that Parliament is sovereign, and that means that one government cannot bind a future Parliament by making a promise and then leaving it for the next government to deliver the results. That isn't how British democracy works.
If the government ignored one of its biggest referendum results in history, then its relationship with its people would be absolutely obliterated. It would send the crystal clear message that you are free to vote for whatever you want so long as you vote according to our preferences. And that isn't democracy. That's a sham.
On the one hand, yes, calling a referendum and ignoring the results is a bit shitty. On the other hand, the government could just as easily not call the referendum, and then you'd be in the exact same situation. Since the British government could exist from now until infinity without ever calling a referendum on EU membership, it doesn't really make sense to frame the integrity of parliamentary democracy around something that is not essential to parliamentary democracy. This leads to the fundamental point. and the main reason why a second referendum wouldn't destroy British democracy. Referendums aren't an institution of British democracy. See, there is a major institution of British democracy, and that is parliamentary sovereignty. I know I've said that already, but it bears repeating. We elect MPs, those MPs then have to balance their desire to represent what they believe is best for their constituents against what their party calls for. Generally, of course, MPs vote with their party, but of course, sometimes MPs will let their personal beliefs be relevant. This is why we have rebellions. For my part, I like this. I like that MPs vote with their conscience rather than just doing as they're told, even while it might fall into conflict with the idea of party politics sometimes and make it a bit hard to know exactly what you're getting. But there is no room for this idea that MPs are obligated to enact referendum results that contradict both the stance of their party and their conscience. There are some people out there who think that it is anti-democratic for a political party to oppose Brexit. That is the point we're at. This referendum result is defining everything to the point that a party that is all about globalism cannot be consistent in holding to a globalist message without being called anti-democratic, even though this is all in reference to a referendum that they didn't call for. Party politics has been sacrificed on the altar of referendum über alles. This Brexit means Brexit lunacy is steamrolling every institution of British democracy while claiming that any attempt to stop it would be the death of British democracy. See, yes, if a parliament called a referendum and then ignored it, that would be shitty. Mostly because you shouldn't call a referendum you're not prepared to deliver on. David Cameron called the referendum as a disgusting political power play to get votes from UKIP. He decided he wasn't going to deliver on that referendum, choosing to resign instead, because he's a spineless prick. Fuck David Cameron and fuck his referendum. David Cameron's referendum was a lie, and for that he deserves eternal scorn. However, Cameron left. Every pro-Brexit MP didn't get very far in the leadership contest. Theresa May took over, and then she called a general election where her mandate took a massive hit, leaving her without a working majority. Parliament has moved on from David Cameron, and if they were being logical, they would have moved on from his referendum as well. This is why I say referendums in the UK should be treated as personal things. They are not institutions of British democracy. The AV vote was because of a personal conflict between Nick Clegg and David Cameron. The EU vote was because of a conflict between David Cameron and his Eurosceptic backbenchers. British democracy supersedes these personal conflicts, and when these personalities leave government, they take with them any obligations they incurred as leader of the government. Cameron had an obligation to deliver on the referendum he called, but when he left, he took that obligation with him.
To once again put that shoe on the other foot, if the Remain campaign had won, and the Leave campaign was now arguing to increase the voting age and to exclude UK citizens that are living outside of the UK, then their motive would be just as obvious.
The logic for decreasing the voting age is that leaving the EU will probably be a long-lasting decision that might not be reversed for a generation, if not several. Therefore, it makes sense that the young people would get special preference. By contrast, there is no reasonable justification for raising the voting age, as this guy suggests. There is definitely an argument to be made that votes regarding long-lasting decisions should exclude those on death's door and include those just coming of age. For example, I had 2 elderly relatives who were able to vote Leave in the referendum and then die before the 2017 general election. I also have 3 younger relatives who weren't old enough to vote in the 2016 referendum, and all of them are pro-EU. I do agree with Rationality rules that any prospective rule changes would not justify a second referendum though, just pointing out his analogy is a bit silly.
Anyhow, I appreciate that there are many more arguments given, but those just covered are indeed the most popular, and I hope that no matter whether you are for Brexit or against it, and there are many great arguments on both sides, you can see why a second referendum that includes an option to stay in the EU would be an affront to democracy.
In my opinion, British democracy has been dying for a while. In some sense, you could say it died in 2015 when UKIP gained 12% of the vote and only 1 seat. General elections matter, and that general election was incredibly unrepresentative. Indeed, I believe British democracy is dying right now. We have a leader who everybody hates, who loses more and more of her mandate every day, and yet she is acting incredibly autocratic, throwing Parliament under the bus and trying to force through legislation. There has always been a general degree of dignity in Parliament that says, when it's obvious everyone hates you, you stand down. Theresa May is flagrantly ignoring this and clinging on to power in a rather disturbing way. These represent, to some degree, the death of British democracy, as they relate to general elections and Parliament, 2 key institutions of British democracy. An ignored referendum result is not the death of British democracy. Indeed, the referendum in the first place and the continued expectation that the result will be delivered is doing a lot to destroy British democracy. If Cameron hadn't called a referendum he wasn't willing to respect the results of, we wouldn't have a referendum. If British MPs were free to vote with what they believe is in the country's interests, Article 50 would have been revoked by now. By all means, continue to insist that the results of this referendum are respected, but be warned, in doing so, you may very well kill British democracy by undermining the integrity of all its fundamental institutions.
Brexit won, and that's that. It must be delivered, and failing to do so would mean the death of the United Kingdom's democracy.
I'm a Remainer. I voted Remain, I would do again. But I think democracy dictates that we actually enact the will of the people, which was to leave.
The leaflet said, whatever you vote, we will put into place. And if you make a promise like that,
David
then yes,
Cameron
that's
said once only. Once only, once in a lifetime vote. He didn't say we'll have another one before we even try and enact the result of the first one. My point is, you voted to leave this country. We have to try it. If it fails, you can have another referendum and you can try and go another way, right? But you have to try it.
In your opinion? In your opinion?
No, in the opinion of democracy. It's called democracy.
Yeah.
That's what it is, actually.
On second thoughts, I didn't realise Piers Morgan was on your side. In that case, I revoke all my criticisms. Anyway, like if you liked, dislike if you disliked, constructive criticism always welcome in the comments, share the video with your friends, follow me on Twitter and retweet the video there. Subscribe and get the bell on so you get notified of every new video. Also, over on the other channel, my other channel, my friend and I are speaking about the Passion of the Christ, and there are some quite interesting takes on there. Final note, I have a Patreon where you can give me $1. You can give me $3 to vote on videos and suggest videos, although I don't really know how to make it all work. Also, I've been thinking about doing a Patreon question of the month thing, which I think is a neat idea, but I don't know anything about how Patreon works really, so I don't know, it will happen at some point. Thank you to my patrons, Hannah Taylor, Kirsten LRX89, Stephen, Nancy Diamond, and Stephen Lester. Yes, that list is getting longer by the day, and I appreciate that so much.
Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!